sad circumstances in some regard. It's war. Perhaps we might start with the ancient era.
The Iranian regime are Messianic. Part of their Messianic outlook is that the Jews must be uprooted from Palestine.
Does that come from the Quran?
One thing which people don't understand, they believe that the world should convert all of it to Islam. One of the famous battles was at a place called Khaybar, and this is remembered as a great victory.
So the initial conquest was a very bloody conquest by the scimitar. What do we know about the Jews and the Islamic conquerors?
Generally, the picture appears to have been...
I want to understand how this axis developed from 1979 and how Iran became the player that it is.
Here we can go into some side thing which most people don't know about.
So when does that relationship with Hamas begin?
The Hamas emerges in the 70s as an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. The Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories since 1967 has been a military occupation. We presented it as enlightened, but there's no such thing as an enlightened military occupation. The Gaza Strip has no future. Trump put his finger on it when he said...
Before you hear from Israel's most esteemed historian, Dr. Benny Morris, I ask if you want to support this show. All you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Dr. Morris exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media don't touch. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you will hear an extended conversation where Dr. Morris takes your questions specifically about what regime change in Iran looks like. But without further ado, Dr. Benny Morris. Dr. Benny Morris, an absolute privilege to speak with you, Israel's most esteemed historian. Thank you for having me.
Exaggerating, but okay.
No, it's absolutely the case. Of course, why I'm here is sad circumstances in some regard. It's war. We are, as we're speaking now, 8 days into Operation Rising Lion, which is launched by Benjamin Netanyahu against Iran, specifically, or the stated aim of getting rid of the nuclear program run by the Ayatollahs and the Iranian regime. I wanted to speak with you about the whole conflict and not only Israel-Iran relations in the modern era, particularly after 48 and after 79, but perhaps we might start with the ancient era because there are so many references on both sides to historic incidences, stories between these two nations. For example, Operation Rising Lion itself, a reference to the lion that was on the Iranian flags before 79, was also apparently a reference to Numbers 23-24. Netanyahu has said that, I'll quote him, "I want to tell you that 2,500 years ago, Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, liberated the Jews, and today a Jewish state is creating the means to liberate the Persian people." Not only that, the Iranians have named one of their missiles the Khaybar Shekan missiles, and the Battle of Khaybar was the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So both sides are referencing ancient times, and I think perhaps before we get into modern times, let's start with that. How would you set how would you describe this ancient relationship between the Persians and the Israelis, or the nation of Israel?
Well, the current situation looked at in long-term perspective is sort of paradoxical because the Persians, now called Iranians, but the Persians are regarded in Jewish history as a nation essentially favorable towards the Jews, supportive of the Jews, partly because Cyrus, as you mentioned, Cyrus the Great, around 430 something BC, apparently allowed the repatriation of Jews who had been exiled by the Babylonians in whatever it is, 586 BC, had been exiled by the Babylonians when they crushed the Judea, the Jewish state, and destroyed its first temple. They exiled at least some, probably the elite of the Jewish population in Judea, to Babylon, to Mesopotamia. Along came Cyrus the Great and conquered Babylon, defeated the Babylonian or Median Empire, and then said to the Jews who were in exile on the shores of the Euphrates and the Tigris, you can go home now, and allowed them to repatriate back to Judea, where they were also allowed by the Persians to rebuild the temple, which became the Second Temple, which, as we know, eventually was destroyed by the Romans 500 years later. But because of that, the Persians were regarded as a pro-Jewish empire, as opposed to the Babylonians or the Assyrians who destroyed Jewish kingdoms, and so on.
But even at that time, shortly after that, you have the story which is told in the book of Esther, which Netanyahu has also referenced, and he also said, I think he said this a couple of years ago, 2,500 years ago, an enemy arose in Persia under King Ahasuerus, who sought to destroy the Jews. They did not succeed then, neither will they succeed today.
Okay, there was this second event, if you like, a worm in the apple, in which there was a Persian king who at some point was thinking about destroying the Jewish community in Persia on the advice of his aide or whatever, Haman, and eventually was persuaded by the beautiful Jewish woman, Esther, to turn pro-Jewish, and killed Haman and saved the Jews. So there was this episode of potential genocide against the Jews in Persia, but it didn't happen.
This is after Cyrus.
Yes. But this is something which didn't happen.
Right.
So what remains is what did happen, which was Cyrus helped the Jews return to Zion, recreate their temple, and eventually recreate their sovereignty.
Yes, but nevertheless, there is
a dualism.
A dualism that comes from ancient times.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Netanyahu wants to lean into the positive.
Yeah.
And he's calling for the Cyrus Accords, and perhaps we can get into what that might look like. But it's also the case from the Iranian side, as I mentioned, this ancient references like the Khaybar. But perhaps we should get into that. Can you explain the story? Now, a quick interruption from our sponsor, Ground News. We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website help me and my team cut through media bias and get the full picture on any news story. Let's take a quick example. How the media is covering Trump's new travel ban. Left-leaning The Intercept ran the headline, Trump travel ban punishes victims of the US war machine. Now let's turn to Ground News to see how the rest of the media is covering this story. There are over 415 published on Trump's new travel ban, and we can access every single one through Ground News, complete with source context and a breakdown of key information. Meanwhile, right-leaning The Blaze ran the headline, Trump announces total ban on travel from 12 countries. Just focusing on the key information, which is a very different narrative from The Intercept. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential for making informed decisions and spotting media bias. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I encourage you to check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded, and by supporting my sponsors, you are supporting this show. But back to the interview.
Okay, well, here we're talking, it's not just a question of Jews and Persians, or Jews and what is today called Iranians. It's also to do with Jews and Islam. And when they talk about Khaybar, we're talking about Islam and the Jews, not Persia and the Jews. When Muhammad came to power in Mecca and in Hijaz, in Arabia, when the Islam arose from among the Arab tribes in Hijaz, in Saudi Arabia, they were confronted by Jewish tribes who lived in Arabia. Today, of course, there's no Jews in Saudi Arabia, but then there were Jewish tribes living in Saudi Arabia or in the area of Arabia. And they opposed, they didn't accept, according to the Quran, that's really the only real historical reference we have to this. But the Quran says, according to the Quran, the Jews opposed Muhammad, didn't accept him as a prophet, didn't accept his so-called revelation, and apparently physically opposed him. According to the Quran, the Jews in Arabia even tried to poison Muhammad. And as a result of this conflict between the newly Muslim tribes under Muhammad and the Jewish tribes in Arabia, the Muslims eventually turned against the Jewish tribes and destroyed them utterly, in fact. They killed everybody, they raped everybody, they enslaved whoever remained, and there are no Jews in Arabia since then. One of the famous battles was at a place called Khaybar, where they destroyed one of the Jewish tribes, and this is remembered as a great victory in Islam at its origins under Muhammad.
It's worth...
So when Arabs refer, and now Persians who are Muslims, refer to Khaybar and call one of their rockets or whatever it is, Khaybar, named after this victory over the Jews in Arabia 1,500 or whatever number of years it is ago.
Yes, yeah. I think it was 628.
Okay.
So it's the last few years of Muhammad's
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
I know we've already covered about 1,000 years in this short conversation so far, but it was worth staying here for one moment for two reasons. One is the how Shia Islam comes about, but the other is that I had a recent guest on the show called Raymond Ibrahim, who is a historian, American historian of Coptic heritage, who has written about the Islamic wars of conquest. Now, you already have just described how the Jews in Arabia were treated. At this period, the whole region was Christian. And
apart from the few Jews who lived, and there were pagans. And there were pagans. There were Christians, pagans, and Jews in the 7th century in the Middle East, in different proportions in different parts of the Middle East.
Okay, so can you paint that picture for me?
Well, the area had been, some of it, Palestine had been Jewish essentially in the 1st, 2nd centuries AD. In the 4th century, the beginning of the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire, which ruled basically the Mediterranean basin, including much of the Middle East, the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, and Christianity then began to rise. Christians also not especially liking the Jews and trying to convert the pagans who lived here. And a lot of people here were pagans, not necessarily in Palestine, but areas around, tried to convert them to Christianity. And during the following centuries in Palestine and elsewhere, there was sort of a coexistence between the Christians, the pagans, and the small Jewish minorities who lived in this area. When Islam arose in the 7th century, they also tried to convert. Once they conquered the areas, they tried to convert Christians and pagans to Islam, which they did very successfully over the following few hundred years. Gradually, there were less and less Christians. I'm not saying there weren't any, but less and less Christians, and very few pagans remained by more or less the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. And Jews remained in certain areas, but subordinated to Islam.
Mm-hmm. So the initial conquest was a very bloody conquest, very much by the scimitar at that point. What do we know about what incidents happened there between the Jews and the Islamic conquerors? What do we know about their interactions?
Generally, the picture appears to have been that they did not kill Jews when they encountered Jewish communities in the various areas, except, as I say, in Hijaz, in the initial eruption of Islam. But in the areas they conquered after leaving Arabia, going northwards and westwards, North Africa and so on, they didn't kill the Jews, they didn't kill the Christian communities they encountered. Usually they coexisted with pressure on these communities to convert to Islam. Pressure directed from the government, pressure by from the ground upwards, and gradually they were successful. But the Jews were not, as far as I recall, generally slaughtered, as they would be incidentally later when the Christians came back to the area in the Crusades. They actually slaughtered Jews and occasionally slaughtered Muslim civilian communities. Mm-hmm. But the Muslims weren't famous for doing this during their years of expansion in the Middle East and in North Africa, which we're talking about the 7th and 8th centuries.
But is that not quite a different treatment then to how they treated Christians? Because the history of the period was that the Christians were slaughtered, and it was constant battles and wars between the two civilizations.
The Jews were a very small minority in every place they were encountered by the Muslim conquerors. They didn't represent a threat, and they were submissive. You know, people come around with what's called the sword of Islam. You call it scimitars, and you accept it and accept submission to it. And the Muslims, that was their guiding principle. If you submit to Islam, don't bear arms, don't have horses, move off the pavement if the Muslim is walking towards you. If you are submissive, we'll accept your submission and your presence, and you will even gain our protection in exchange for that submission. And this was the state of the Christians was something else. The Christians were large numbers of them, and they were an extension of Christian kingdoms and empires to the north, who were Islam's enemies. And the Muslims fought the Byzantine Empire, and they fought France's, Charlemagne or whatever, in France. They encountered Christian empires with armies and looked at the Christians who lived among them, the Christians they had just conquered, as potential subversives within their kingdom. So they were regarded in some ways as enemies, and they were treated fiercely or violently as compared to how the Muslims treated small Jewish communities, which were essentially not threatening.
Yeah, and it is the case when I've read through this history that you have sometimes the Jews aligning with Muslims to fight against Christians, sometimes Christians aligning with Muslims to fight against Jews, sometimes Christians aligning with Muslims to fight against other Christians. It's just kind of constant ever-changing.
It changes in different places, but throughout the Jews are always a very small minority. We're talking about a very small number of people. So they don't, even if they align with somebody, supposedly, with one side or another, in most places they're irrelevant. They're not consequential.
What happened, sorry, I'm going to go back one step. After the temple fell in 70, what happened to the bulk of the Jews? Where did they go?
Historians don't have the full facts. We don't have the full facts. What we know is the Romans who conquered, who beat the first Jewish revolt and subsequently beat the second Jewish revolt. The first one was 66 to 70 AD. The second one erupted under a man called Bar Kokhba in 132 AD and was crushed by the Romans in 135 AD. In both cases, after crushing the revolts, the Romans took hostage or took as captives much of the elite of the Jewish community, of the Jews who had rebelled. But what happened to the majority of the Jews in Judea after the first and second revolts is not clear. Traditional historiography has always said that the Romans just exiled the Jews from Palestine. This is nonsense. As we now know from archaeological evidence, Jews continued to live here, built synagogues in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries. So there were a substantial number of Jews still remaining in Palestine. But as Christianity became dominant and grew, some Jews obviously converted to Christianity, and their numbers, and then when the Muslims came, some converted or left the country also. And we're talking about Palestine. So the Jewish numbers steadily decreased until by the Middle Ages there are very few Jews living in Palestine. But it was a gradual process of self-exile in most cases, in small numbers, forced exile. In most cases, apparently, they felt more comfortable moving out of Roman or Christian or later Muslim domination.
Want to try and get my head into the ideology of the current regime in Iran, the Ayatollahs, the mullahs of Tehran. And so I want to understand the Shia component to that.
Well, the Shias were a small breakaway from the mainstream of Islam, grew up, the Shiites emerged, grew as a movement, as a minority, sometimes persecuted by the majority of the Sunnis, and in some ways paranoid about how they were being treated by the Sunni majority. There were initially battles between the two, but they had and this, I think, is what's relevant to this day. There is a paranoia among Shiites, and some of it, perhaps, as they say, paranoid sometimes have a reason for their paranoia, for being maltreated or ill-treated or sidelined by the majority. This is what happened to Shiites in Lebanon in the 19th and 20th centuries, which is one of the reasons how the Shiism grew, or one of the reasons it became rebellious and powerful in the form of Hezbollah in the last century.
So that's subjugation by other Sunni Muslims.
Yes, by other Muslims. Yes, yes.
So what's the relationship then with Jews and Shia? Is that different to Jews and Sunnis?
I don't know whether there's something ideological there which makes the Jews more of a target for Shiites than it does among Sunnis. I don't think there's a difference. But in the encounters between Israel and Shiism, at least from the mid-20th century in Lebanon, the encounter has been one of hostility. Israel basically in 1982 conquering southern Lebanon, which is the dominant population of southern Lebanon.
This is the first Lebanon War.
Yeah, the first Lebanon War. The dominant population there in numbers was Shiite. Eventually the Shiites there felt oppressed by the Israeli occupation, and out of which arose the Hezbollah, the resistance movement against Israeli occupation, which turned into the Hezbollah into a major organization, the major non-governmental organization opposing the state of Israel, basically. Right. Opposing Israeli occupation, but further than that, beyond that, wanting essentially Israel's destruction.
Right. Non-governmental, but they have seats in government.
Yes, but no, there was essentially a terrorist or guerrilla, whichever you want to call it, organization, which eventually was co-opted into and eventually dominated Lebanon's government. But it was very anti-Israeli, and not just because of the occupation. Here we can go into some side thing which most people don't know about. In 1948, during the first Israeli-Arab War, Israel conquered the Galilee, some of which was earmarked for Israeli Jewish sovereignty by the United Nations, some of which wasn't. In the area which was supposed to be part of the emergent Palestinian state, which the Palestinians opposed, they opposed the partition resolution by the UN General Assembly from 1947, and then went to war against Israel. But in that map drawn up by the United Nations General Assembly, some of the Galilee was apportioned for Arab sovereignty, and in the northern strip of the Galilee, there were 7 Shiite villages. And to this day, and these were conquered by Israel. The Galilee, most of it, all of it, was conquered eventually by the IDF, by the Israeli army, in October, November, beginning of November 1948. And these Shiite villages were essentially destroyed. They were overrun and destroyed, and eventually replaced by Israeli settlements, by new Israeli settlements on their lands. And to this day, the Hezbollah, when it talks about Israel and reaching some sort of supposed accommodation with Israel, and they don't really want an accommodation with Israel, the Hezbollah wants to destroy Israel, but in some form of accommodation, at least temporary, they demand that Israel give up these 7 villages, that is this strip of northern Galilee, and give it back to the Shiites who used to live there. So there's this, in addition to territory inside Lebanon, which Israel is currently occupying, which the Hezbollah and the Lebanese government want Israel to leave, they also want, at least the Hezbollah, Israel to abandon and evacuate the areas conquered in 1948, which had Shiite villages there.
Okay. So steering back now towards Iran, we're in 1948. What is the Iranian response to the Israel War of Independence, or as the Palestinians call it, the so-called Nakba?
Okay, the Iranians were ruled in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, until 1979, by the Shah, his parents, and then the Shah of Iran, Pahlavi, and he may have been opposed, or at least the Iranian government of 1948, 47, 48, opposed the emergence of a Jewish state. But once the Jewish state came into being, the Shah, who was also regarded as an enemy in some way of the Arabs. There's always been conflict between the Iranians and the Arabs. This is historic. Antagonism between these two peoples who've dominated the Middle East and tried to rule all of the Middle East. The Shah made his peace with the Jewish state, and eventually, within the 1950s, became, if you like, the major supplier of oil to the Jewish state. This Jewish state had a major problem. Palestine, before Israel was emerged in 1948, received its oil from Iraq, from British companies shipping the oil from Iraq to Palestine. Once this oil stopped coming, because Israel and Iraq were antagonists in the 48 war, Israel had to have a supplier of oil. And the man who stepped in, I suppose for economic reasons, but also because, as I say, there was a subterranean hostility between Arabs and Iranians, stepped in and provided Israel from that point on, from the 50s on, as its major supplier of oil. And this was crucial. Oil is, of course, crucial to a modern state. Later, the relationship between Israel and the Shah developed beyond oil into, in various ways, political support and security arrangements. Israel trained or helped train the Iranian Secret Service, I think it was called the Shavak, and helped Iran, if you like, helped the Shah in some ways suppress his opponents in Iran. At least that's what the opponents claim, that they trained the people who used to torture opponents of the regime. So Israel sort of got a bad name in this sense before the 1979 revolution as supporters of the Shah.
How popular was the Shah in Iran? How popular was that regime?
Apparently, the Shah was not that popular among Iranians. He lived a lavish, modern, if you like, Western life. He had a lot of money. He spent it on things. Iranians were poor. They didn't like this elite around him, the Shah and the elite around him. And he became increasingly unpopular. And one has to remember that like among the Arabs, among the Iranians, religion is extremely important. Islam is taken seriously. It's not the West, where people can say there is a God, there isn't a God. Even if there is a God, we don't care. He doesn't rule our lives, and he doesn't affect our politics. In the Arab world, God's existence and what Allah supposedly wants, as interpreted by his various vicars, is important. And the Shah was apparently not particularly religious. Maybe he was anti-religious in some ways, because among his opponents were, of course, the mullahs, the many of the mullahs at least. So he became very unpopular, especially among the masses in the rural areas, who turned out to support the Islamic Revolution, which took place in 1979.
Yeah, so 1979, the Islamic Revolution happens, and how does that change relations with Israel?
Well, the relations are radically changed by the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. Khomeini, the head of who emerges as the dominant figure in this revolution, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, which emerges, he is an anti-Semite. In his writings, he expresses himself as an anti-Semite, in line with various things which appear in the Quran vis-a-vis Jews, stemming from the Jewish opposition to Muhammad at the start of the emergence of Islam back in the 7th century. But he's an anti-Semite, and this goes down the chain of command in the Islamic Republic. The building which housed the Israeli embassy, or at least it was called the Israeli legation, is immediately handed over to the PLO, to Israel's Palestinian opponents. And that's how the regime continues as a vociferously anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli regime, Khomeini calling from the beginning for Israel's destruction as a major policy aim of the new regime.
Yeah, so death to Israel is that sort of chant by him and his claque. That is immediate.
Yeah, death to the big Satan, America, and its ward in the Middle East, Zionism and Israel, death to Israel as well.
I see. Okay. So the war we're currently in is against Iran, which the Israel side are saying it's the head of the snake, the head of the octopus, the mothership the head of what its proxies are, which we've already talked about, Hezbollah. We'll carry on then. Then there's Hamas and the Houthis. And so we have this sort of axis of evil from the Western point of view. I want to understand how this axis developed from 1979, how these different factions developed and how Iran became the player that it is.
Well, I think Iran exploited the new Islamic regime in Iran, which unfortunately for them immediately was engaged in war with Iraq. Iraq attacked them in 1980. War continued until 1988. But the Iranians were interested in finding allies in the Middle East who could in some ways help them. Maybe help them initially against Iraq, but eventually against the little Satan, the state of Israel. And the Iranians understood that one way to do that is to mobilize and utilize Shiite minorities in the Middle East who would feel friendly to, in various ways, Iran. Their mullahs, their ayatollahs studied in Iran. They were connected to Iran. They learned Persian when they came from Lebanon. They learned Persian when they reached Iran and were educated in Iran in various ways in terms of the religion. They understood that they could use these minorities, especially the minority in Lebanon, as an extension of Iranian power. And eventually, I don't know if they understood this from the beginning, but eventually they understood that these minorities could also be utilized against the little Satan, against Israel, against Americans also, incidentally. I mean, the Hezbollah in Lebanon from the beginning when it emerged in 82, 83, began to bomb American targets, the American embassy in Beirut, American Marines stationed in Beirut, and so on, at the same time as attacking Israeli targets after Israel occupied southern Lebanon up to Beirut in 1982-83. So they found a willing minority which needed arms, which needed political and economic help, which it got from Iran and the instructors, and they groomed, if you like, the Shiites in Lebanon as an ally. And they did the same in later years with the Houthis, another Shiite minority in the Middle East, the Houthi rebels, who eventually managed to conquer about half of Yemen, the northern half of Yemen, including the
Take me back to the beginning. What year does
I think it begins in the early 80s. While Iran is engaged in war with the Iraqis, they are beginning to send out feelers and instructors and mobilizers and money, as I say, and arms to these Shiite minorities whom they think can help them in their battles in the Middle East, especially eventually against the Jews, Israel.
Right, okay. And so those are Houthi minorities, but Hamas, of course, are Sunni.
Yeah, there's a problem here. The problem, they also eventually send out feelers and money to others who are engaged against Israel, which of course is the Hamas in the Gaza Strip. They happen to be Sunni, but because they both hate Israel, they can make common cause, even though there is a Shiite-Sunni rivalry throughout Islam and throughout the Middle East. But on this particular point, hatred for Israel, this is sufficient to join forces.
So when does that relationship with Hamas begin?
We don't know exactly. The Hamas emerges in the 70s in the Gaza Strip as an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. They are like the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. It emerges the late 60s, but basically in the 70s and the 80s, initially as a social welfare organization, which was one of the things the Muslim Brotherhood did in Egypt also. They gave out money, kindergartens, health clinics, and so on. But eventually they turned to terrorism, or they turned to military action or resistance against Israel. And this happens in the 80s. But from that point on, and it's not clear exactly when Iranian money begins to arrive there with this Sunni rebellious group, but it begins to arrive probably pretty early in the emergence of Hamas as a military organization.
So we have the 1979 revolution. We've got through. You've talked about the first Lebanon war. Then we have the first Gulf War. Now, how does that change things in the region?
The first Gulf War. Well, it's not directly. The first Gulf War is not directly connected to the Israeli-Arab or Israeli Iranian relationship, as far as I know. Well, what I know about it is that Saddam Hussein rains down missiles on Israel as part of his struggle with the Americans over Kuwait and during that first Gulf War. The Iranians are probably just happy to sit on the sidelines and see two of their enemies fighting it out against each other, Saddam Hussein and the Americans.
So by this point anyway, Khamenei has come to power. That was 1989. So we have a new Ayatollah. What's the difference between Khamenei's approach to Israel and Khomeini, his predecessor?
I don't know if there is a great difference between the two supreme leaders in their approach to Israel. I think Khamenei is a pupil and the acolyte, whatever you want to call it, of Khomeini, who is the master. He's the man who founds the Islamic Republic. From what I understand, Khamenei adopts Khomeini's position. The whole lot of it. He adopts his position vis-a-vis Israel and vis-a-vis the Jews. That is, he is also anti-Semitic, and he hates Israel and sees it as a cancer. And that's the phrase he uses continuously: a cancer in the Middle East, which must be uprooted.
Yeah. So. Can we just dig in back? We've already touched on the ideology of the Shia stuff, but I want to dig into the sort of rule of the jurists, which the Iranians call the Wilayat ul Faqih, if I've pronounced that correctly. Probably not, and well, certainly not. And this is...
I'm sure I can't either. Go ahead. Yeah.
Within their ideology, it is, they believe that the Messiah cannot return if the Jews rule Jerusalem. So this seems to be sort of quite fundamental to their theocratic worldview.
Yeah, look, the Iranian regime, the Iranian theologians who in some way run the regime are Messianic. And part of their Messianic outlook is that the Jews must be uprooted from Palestine, or what they regard as Palestine, if their mission is successful. And maybe even if the Messiah is going to arrive, they must be uprooted.
Does that come from the Quran?
The Quran describes the Jews as enemies of Islam. I don't think the Quran says the Jews must be necessarily uprooted or killed, but the fact on the ground is that what happens in Hijaz, in the homeland of Islam, is an uprooting of the Jews from the territory. But as I say, Islam later under the rule of Omar, as it's called, agrees for the Jews remaining in Islam, but only as a subject people. And one must remember that the Jews in Iran, since the Islamic Revolution, have not been persecuted in Iran. Here and there, some have been put on trial for spying for Israel or whatever, maybe even hanged. But essentially, the Iranians are neutral and protective towards the Jewish community in Iran. They haven't been anti-Semitic in that sense. They are anti-Semitic in the sense that they talk about Israel as a Jewish state which shouldn't exist. And they, I think, regard Jews in America as a problem because the Jews in America are very important in the American establishment and must be neutralized. Their power in America must be neutralized as part of the war against America. One thing which people don't understand generally about Islam and the fanatical or messianist or Islamist elements in Islam, they believe that the world should convert all of it to Islam, that it shouldn't be restricted only to the Middle East or Iran or Palestine or whatever, but the world should accept the revelation, should accept the truth of Muhammad, and eventually it will, and will convert to Islam out of an understanding that this is the truth.
Right, right. What is the population of Jews in Iran at this time? And maybe even in 1979. Now, how many Jews are there?
Well, nobody knows. The figures run apparently now between 3 and 10,000. That's the numbers I've heard. Today in Iran, there are somewhere between 3 and 10,000 Jews who are living apparently reasonable lives under the watchful eye of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's intelligence and so on. But they apparently live quite comfortably. I don't think they're allowed to travel abroad freely. I think their assets exist under supervision of the Iranian state, meaning that they can be eaten up or confiscated by Iran. And it's one of the reasons why Iranian Jews remain in Iran. They will probably lose everything if they try and leave or flee. But since the Iranian Revolution took over in 1979, the Islamic Revolution, when there were something like 40,000 Jews in Iran, most Jews have left Iran.
Right, okay, so there's been
gradually.
A gradual.
Yeah.
Now, of course, this war, there's talk about regime change, and some members of the Israel government are more explicit than others, but all are explicit that this is about Iran's nuclear program. The beginning of this particular story, it probably starts earlier than this, but in 2002 is the revelation of Iran's nuclear program at Natanz. So I'm curious if you could give me a sort of history of Iran and their nuclear project.
Well, apparently the Shah was the Shah before 1979 initiated some form of nuclear program or an approach to a nuclear program. He wanted nuclear power. I don't think the Americans agreed to establish nuclear power plants in Iran, and I don't think a reactor was set up in Iran, but he was apparently intending to, the Shah, before he was overthrown. During the Iran-Iraq war, I think the Ayatollahs, the regime in Iran, fearing possible defeat in the war against Iraq and fearing for the future, if you like, of the regime, thought that they must begin to invest in nuclear power and eventual nuclear weaponry, to reach nuclear weaponry as a safeguard to the Iranian state, for the Iranian state and for the regime itself. And from 1989 onwards, they are hell-bent on achieving, I believe, nuclear weaponry and begin to establish all the various plants we see around Iran today. Their start is 1989. And as you say, one of the major thresholds which must be crossed in producing nuclear weapons is enrichment of uranium, so that you can then have a supply of it for nuclear warheads to produce the bombs. And that begins around 2002, when it is revealed that in Natanz, the Iranians are building a nuclear enrichment plant.
Right. Because actually they'd had signed the non-proliferation treaty much earlier than that. I've always been a little bit confused about Iran wanting nuclear energy rather than nuclear weaponry, because it's an oil powerhouse. So why exactly did they want nuclear energy in the first place?
We don't know. Look, it appears that they've said, the Iranian regime has always said, its nuclear program is geared to achieving nuclear independence and eventually nuclear energy. Doubters said, well, why do they need nuclear energy if they have so much oil and gas? What will they need it for? Obviously, they're lying, and they actually are heading to nuclear weapons. But it's possible that they're also thinking ahead, which is what people in Saudi Arabia are doing as well. Saudi Arabia has lots of oil and gas, and yet there they are also very interested in establishing nuclear reactors, eventually to supply electricity. So it's quite possible the Iranian regime, the Ayatollahs, were also thinking ahead and said, well, eventually oil will run out and we will need nuclear energy to supply electricity. May be true. But also, and at the moment, from Israel's perspective, they want nuclear weapons, and it's clear that they want a nuclear weapons program, that they're engaged in that, and want the actual weapons from them. And that, coupled with their desire to destroy Israel as a major policy goal, it means that Israel is in existential danger from this nuclear project.
I think we'll come to that, but our history lesson isn't quite over, if I may. So now we've got the second Lebanon War, 2006. How does this change relations in the region, particularly between Israel and Iran?
I don't think the second Lebanon War, as it's called, which wasn't really a war, it was a large skirmish with, 150 Israeli dead. Is that a war? But anyhow, Israel relates to it as the second Lebanon War for some reason, even gives out ribbons, campaign ribbons for the second war. So they relate to it as a war. But what I'm saying is I don't know if it really affects Israeli-Iranian relations. The war did affect Israeli-Hezbollah relations. I think after 2006, the Iranians stepped up their supply of rockets and so on to the Hezbollah, understanding its importance, this organization's importance as a deterrent to Israel, so that Israel won't attack the Iranian nuclear program. But in effect, I don't think the war affected the relations between Israel and Iran. Israel feared the nuclear program in Iran. The Iranians pushed on with their nuclear program to achieve nuclear weaponry, and I don't think the war affected it much, except, as I say, probably the Iranians stepped up their supply of weaponry and financing for the Hezbollah, understanding from Hezbollah's semi-victory in that second Lebanon war that the Hezbollah is a formidable ally of theirs.
I just spoke to former Ambassador Michael Oren, and he was ambassador for Israel to America under Obama's first term as president, not actually during when the JCPOA deal was signed, but he was privy to the sort of mindset of that administration when it came to that deal that they did with Iran. I want the Benny Morris take of the JCPOA deal.
The Americans under Bill Clinton, Obama, Biden, and Bush were reluctant to engage in warfare with Iran, have always been reluctant to engage in hostilities with Iran in order to suppress the nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program, and always preferred, and Trump has been saying the same sort of things, diplomacy over hostilities with Iran. This is increased, this tendency to only go the way of diplomacy and forswear altogether military action has been increased by the Iraq and Afghanistan experiences by America, in which they essentially failed in military engagements against Muslim Middle Eastern power. The way of diplomacy eventually led the Americans, supported by the European community, the United Nations, into the agreement of 2015, which was designed to restrict Iranian progress towards nuclear weaponry. The problem was that the restriction was limited, did not supposedly limited the Iranians in in uranium enrichment, and limited them in other ways, in other facets of this program. The problem from Israel's point of view at the time was that the limitations had a deadline, ended after a certain number of years, 15 years, depends what exactly, in the program, but the Iranians were limited up to a certain point in time, beyond which apparently the Iranians would be free to pursue their nuclear program as they wanted. That was the sense in Israel. Some Israelis favored supporting the agreement as limiting Iran's power to break out towards nuclear weaponry. Most Israelis, including, of course, prominently Netanyahu, opposed this because they thought they were giving the Iranians too much, leaving too much developmental power in the hands of Iran, and, as I say, without restriction after a certain number of years. This was how Israel understood it under Netanyahu.
Well, it's also that, and this was in the public domain, American intelligence, and I believe Israeli intelligence, knew that Iran were trying to enrich uranium. And so whatever deal they were doing, the Iranians were ignoring it anyway.
Well,
so it was kind of...
Well, no. The deal, the agreement of 2015 imposed certain obligations on the Iranians in terms of international supervision by the IAEA. And they planted cameras in various Iranian sites. The problem was the Israelis said the supervision wasn't comprehensive because not everybody... People didn't know what were all of Iran's nuclear sites. There were some sites they knew about. Other sites, Israelis speculated, may exist without any supervision at all, which nobody knew about. In addition, the Iranians controlled the comings and goings of the IAEA inspectors and eventually limited them in what they could inspect, and eventually took off the cameras and God knows what. So the whole supervision system wasn't airtight. And this was problematic in terms of how Israel saw this 2015 deal.
And then 2018, President Trump removes America from the JCPOA deal, although the deal remains with the UK, EU, and other nations, and Iran. Iran is still part of it.
But Iran, from that point on, begins to enrich uranium in quantities and in percentages beyond what was agreed in the agreement.
Right. And as the IAEA have shown, as of end of May 2025, they were enriching up to 60%. They didn't have...
The Iranians themselves said that. It wasn't that there was just the IAEA was saying that the Iranians are going beyond what they had agreed in 2015. The Iranians themselves says, well, now that America's dumped the agreement, we now see ourselves as free from this agreement and will allow ourselves to enrich uranium as much as we liked. Though carefully, they remained under the 90%. In other words, they went up to 60% and under the 90%, which is necessary for uranium enriched enough for nuclear weaponry.
But the distance between those two is not far, right?
Well, according to experts, moving from a 60% enrichment to 90% enrichment is a matter of a week or two in places like Fordow or Natanz. In other words, it's not the big problem is getting from the 3.75% to the 60%. Once you are in 60%, it's a matter of a week or two to actually make that extra mile.
Yeah. This is an important detail worth getting into, because some people are arguing that even right now, Iran is still a couple of years away from getting a bomb. Why are they wrong?
Nobody knows exactly how long it'll take the Iranians, once they have sufficient quantities of enriched uranium at 90%, how long it will take them to make that extra leap from having the enriched uranium and processing it and arranging it and miniaturizing what needs to be done to put it on top of a missile.
Right.
In other words, you can have an enormous nuclear, whatever it's called, item, but it has to be deliverable. And if it's not deliverable on top of a missile, it's not really a useful bomb.
Right.
And that miniaturization and the metallurgy and all sorts of other things which need to be done to get it to fit onto a missile and work as a bomb can take many months, maybe a year, maybe even 2
Right.
years to do. Nobody knows exactly how long it is because nobody knows how much work Iran has already done on the metallurgy and other aspects, chemical aspects and other aspects, making this miniaturization. Nobody knows how far gone they are on that, which is one of the reasons Israel killed all these nuclear scientists they killed on the in the initial offensive of the 13th of June. We went straight for these nuclear scientists who are supposed to lead the teams or are leading the teams in this weaponization of the enriched uranium.
Right, exactly. So as I had understood it, which you've completely expanded on there, which is that there are sort of three components to a nuclear bomb. There's the uranium, there's the item, as you say, the mechanism for the missile, and then there's the launchers. And it seemed that they were nearly there with the uranium, not far off, or enriched uranium specifically. They actually have the launchers with the missiles, but we don't know what the story was with this last aspect. And you're saying, as if I understood this, maybe we're a year or two away from that, but maybe we're not because we just don't know. It's just not clear.
Yeah, all of this has been done in secret by the Iranians and will continue to be done in secret by the Iranians. The weaponization of the material and the preparation of the material for a warhead, making a miniature warhead which can be on top of a missile. But nobody knows how long that will take the Iranians and under what conditions. Presumably, if Israel has destroyed large parts of this process, destroying labs, which we don't hear about, but destroying the labs, killing the nuclear scientists which are in charge of the labs. This will push the Iranians further back in the process of reaching a warhead. But nobody knows how long this could take.
So before we come to the June 13th, this latest conflict, can we go back to October 7th? And we've touched on this sort of axis of evil, but can you paint the picture of where the axis of evil is, i.e. Iran with its proxies across the Middle East before October 7th?
Okay, before October 7th.
Well, on October 7th, I should say.
Before October 7th, 2023, the Iranians were financing and organizing a circle of fire, if you like, that's what it was called, around Israel of its various proxies and allies, which included, of course, primarily the Hezbollah, an organization of some 40,000 fighters with thousands of rockets. Nobody knows exactly how many. Nothing like the Iranian rockets of today, which are very, very large, smaller rockets, but still in their
ballistic missiles.
I think they're called ballistic missiles, but they're very small. Okay. They have a 30 to 50 kilogram warhead. Okay. Today's missiles have 1,000 kilograms or more.
Well, the Iranian is I think half a ton.
Yeah, some of them are half a ton, but the rumor is that they have some rockets which have 1.5 tons today.
Oh, is that right?
That's what they say. I don't know if it's true. In any case, they spent the years before 2023 or financing, arming, and organizing these various proxies. The chief one was the Hezbollah in Lebanon, which had tens of thousands of rockets. Israel spoke of 100,000 small rockets, which could reach as far as Dimona or Tel Aviv, some of them. They had another proxy, which was the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, which people always forget, in the Gaza Strip, with tens of thousands of fighters and a smaller quantity of rockets. And they had a proxy in Yemen, the Houthi rebels, who'd taken over about half of Yemen over the years. And these were armed with larger rockets produced and delivered by the Iranians, or at least the materials for them were delivered to the Houthis, who were then assembling them in Yemen. And they had some other proxies people don't talk about, militias in Iraq and in Syria, and the Syrian regime itself under a man called Bashar Assad, the son of Hafez al-Assad, who ruled Syria over the past decades. The Assad regime in Syria was very important because this was the route through which the Iranians could deliver their materials including instructors and so on, to Hezbollah in Lebanon. They landed the materials in the ports or in the airports in Syria and delivered to the Hezbollah. This was the connection. And the regime itself had an army, though it was involved in, the regime in Damascus was involved in a civil war from 2010, 2011. As part of the Arab Spring, there was a rebellion against the Bashar Assad regime, a tyrannical sort of Shiite regime. Alawis they're called, but they're a branch of Shiism. They were busy fighting mostly Sunni rebels in Syria between 2011 and 2024. But they nonetheless, the Sunni regime had an army with anti-aircraft batteries, missile batteries. They had armored divisions and so on. And as I said, they had the ports through which they could supply, the Iranians could supply their Hezbollah proteges. This regime in Damascus, this you can call it one of the proxies of Iran, was felled as a result of Israel destroying the Hezbollah, which had helped prop up this regime during the civil war in Syria. Once the Hezbollah was knocked out, the Syrians no longer had the support of the Hezbollah fighters they were using to kill the Sunni rebels, and eventually the Sunni rebels managed to stage a blitzkrieg against the regime in December 2024 and overthrew the Assad regime, which actually fell apart like a house of cards.
Yes, this is with Jilani, who we might come back to in a moment. So the Alawites, as in it's the Alawites, right? We're referring to they're Shias.
They're a type of Shia, yeah.
And what's their relationship with Iran? Does Iran care that they're Shias?
Yes. No, that's one of the reasons that they supported this regime. This was another Shiite minority in Syria. They're 10 or 15 or 20% of the population of Syria. But somehow Assad, the father, Hafiz Assad, with his cronies from the Alawite community, came to dominate the Syrian army, and in the 60s took control of Syria, 69, 70. And from that point on, the Assad regime ruled Syria until 2024, in other words, for 54 years. Assad, the father, died around the year 2000, and the son, Bashar Assad, took over and continued to rule, backed by this Alawi minority, which controlled the security services and the army during those years, as I say, into a civil war, which eventually the Alawites lost.
The Jilani's interesting because only recently I think this week actually, or maybe last week, has given permission officially for the Israelis to use Syrian airspace to down Iranian drones and missiles.
More importantly, he's given Israel permission to overfly Syria to reach Iran. That's the point. The knocking down missiles and so on is all very good and well, and Israel has done that over Syria. But the flights of hundreds of Israeli aircraft daily across Syrian territory into Iraq, which has no air force and no anti-aircraft capabilities, which means it's a wasteland and no man's land in terms of the warfare between Israel and Iran. Overflying Syria was very important.
Why can't they do that over Jordan?
Well, it depends on which route you take, but I think the route is simpler through Syria.
Okay. So is this a sort of moment of hope for relations between Syria and Israel?
Well, Israel has been hoping since Jilani and his Sunni rebels took over government in Damascus in December 2024. Israel has been hoping that maybe the man who was traditionally a jihadist, very anti-Zionist, very anti-Israeli, belonged to ISIS, has changed his ways, changed his spots. Some Israelis say that a jihadist can change his spots, remains anti-Israeli, whatever he agrees to in terms of pragmatism for the first few years while he consolidates power in Damascus. He's going to remain an anti-Israeli and an opponent of Israel. But others say, well, people sometimes in power Bashar moderate their views, change their views. And it's true that on a number of issues, he has reached accommodation with Israel over the past month since he took power. One of them has been that he didn't do much to protect the assets of the Syrian army left behind when Bashar Assad fled Syria. Since December, there were large air bases with large numbers of MiG and Sukhoi fighters. There are armored divisions with lots of tanks. There's anti-aircraft batteries and so on. All of these, the Israeli army attacked during December and after December. As the Assad regime was falling, the Israeli Air Force attacked all these sites, chemical plants in Syria, in order to deprive whatever government took over in Syria, Giuliani's government, wouldn't have these types of military assets which could endanger Israel. And he didn't actually do anything about this. He didn't resist any of this, and maybe even didn't criticize Israel's behavior over Syrian territory. It's a bit unusual, the whole thing.
It is a bit unusual.
Yeah, but that's what happened. They simply, Israel had complete freedom of the sky and to bomb whatever they wanted in Syria, which meant essentially the assets of the old Syrian army.
They also took over the DMZ zone between the two nations
and Israel,
an additional 500 square kilometers.
We don't know exactly how many, because Israel hasn't talked about that, but the Israeli troops, soon after Giuliani took over, in Damascus, Israeli troops entered the DMZ between the Golan Heights and Syria and occupied various positions in the DMZ, which was supposed to be controlled by United Nations forces. So they're also there alongside the Israeli army. But the Syrian army is no longer there. Giuliani isn't there. And Israeli troops sorted beyond the DMZ into southern Syria and took over and established apparently even positions inside Syria proper. In other words, east of the DMZ.
Do you not think that that's pretty provocative thing? Is that not?
Well, one would think that this is provocative behavior, but the Giuliani government seems to have accepted this rather than open hostilities with Israel, which it can't, of course, win. Israeli army is too strong for Giuliani's ragtag rebel forces. But he may also feel this is a humiliation and keeping quiet about this for some later day to take revenge.
For diplomatic reasons, right now.
Yes, he needs America. He needed America to drop sanctions on Syria, and America agreed to drop those sanctions on Syria, imposed on the Assad regime in the years before, because it had violated all sorts of treaties to do with chemical weapons and other things. So Giuliani probably thought, okay, let's let the Israelis play even on our territory, at least for a while, and let's get onto the good side of the Trump regime, which the Syrians managed to do, because Trump calls Giuliani a nice guy, good-looking, big heart, whatever he says about people he likes.
Did you say big heart?
I think he said something like that, yes. Yeah, I think he said something like that. He also says this about Erdogan of Turkey, who certainly hasn't got a good heart and is no nice guy, but he also showers him with praise every so often also for whatever reasons. So anyhow, Giuliani is interested in beefing up his relationship, is improving his relationship with America, and being good with Israel helps him do that. And,
right.
But whether the man is still a jihadist at heart, we don't know. Maybe he's changed his stripes. Certainly he's changed his suits. Yeah. He wears modern American Western suits.
Modern British Savile Row suits.
British.
I also note that the name Giuliani is of the Golan.
Yes, the family Giuliani. I can't even remember what is his name. I can't remember his name, but his new name. I mean, his real name. But he called himself a nom de guerre Giuliani because his family originates. Some of his family, one side of the family, originates in the Golan Heights, which again is something Israel occupied, the part of Syria occupied in 1967 and in effect annexed and settled with Israeli settlers since 1967. I can't imagine that Giuliani, calling himself Giuliani as his nom de guerre, thinks that he's going to just let that go away and leave part of Syria in Israel's hands. So I should imagine this is something which, even as a Syrian patriot, not a jihadist, he would still like to get back. This is Syrian territory in terms of any Syrian's thinking.
Yeah, quite. Now, it's worth noting that the Golan isn't just the part of the Golan that's within the current Israel border, but there's in southern Syria, there is a part that is also
the Golan Heights is on both sides. And to me, I don't know whether his family originates in the Golan, in the villages inside the Israeli part of the Golan, or, as you say, on the Syrian side of the Golan.
Yes.
But today, people, when they talk about the Golan Heights, they talk about the Israeli part, not about the Syrian part.
So unless he changes his name, we'll have to keep an eye on that one. But it's also the case that Jilani seems to be keeping in line with the Abraham Accord nations, or the Arab Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, who give me personally a lot of hope. The Saudis, the Emiratis, who want trade, peace with Israel and the West. And it seems that he seems to be coming into that side of things. I'm keen to explore that side of the Middle East with you. But we perhaps before we get into that, we talk about since October 7th. So again, this is, as I just described, the octopus with many arms. And I want to kind of get your take on how the conflict since October 7th has affected Iran and this great octopus.
Okay. The conflict as it has evolved since October 2023 has led to the destruction of this ring of fire or ring of resistance, or whatever you want to call it, of the Iranian proxies around Israel. Israel basically smashed the power of the Hamas, even though it remains an active guerrilla organization against Israel inside the Gaza Strip, but it's been destroyed as a potent military organization. It destroyed the Hezbollah in September, October, November 2024, killing its leader, a legendary leader, Nasrallah, and essentially taking out most of its rocket stockpiles. It's managed to, in some way at least, neutralize the Houthi militias in Yemen. They do shoot an occasional rocket once every 3 or 4 days from Yemen towards Israel, but not with great success. I think the Houthi rebel rockets since October 23 have killed exactly one Israeli over the past 2 years. I think it was actually a drone, not a rocket, which reached Tel Aviv and killed an Israeli. But they haven't been very successful, though it keeps Israelis on edge and causes, air raid alarms and so on to go off. But the major success, apart from Hezbollah, in destroying this ring of fire around Israel, has been the fall of the Assad regime and the change in Syria from a pro-Iranian, basically an Iranian proxy state, to something which is anti-Iranian and neutral. Jilani, who represents the Sunni rebels who rebelled against Assad, the Alawite, back in 2011, they are deadly enemies, in fact, at least ideologically, of the Shiite regime in Iran, which supplied Assad with his troops, with his money, with all sorts of aid, weaponry, to crush these Sunnis. And they tortured and killed apparently something like 500,000 Sunnis in crushing or trying to crush the Sunni rebellion during the civil war. So this is something I think is not going to be papered over. It doesn't look like Jilani is going to make his peace with the Iranian regime, and as you say, has allowed Israel basically to overfly Syria, to use it as an ally, if you like, in some way, in their massive air assault on Iran during the past 7 days.
So it might be just on Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas. It might be worth just approaching each of these separately, because, of course, with regard to Hezbollah and Hamas, their high command has been taken out. The famous pager operation, and in Hamas, we most famously Yahya Sinwar, and we've seen the high command taken apart. But the idea remains there. And I think the Houthis is somewhat a different story because, as we saw with Trump, he's had to sort of end his program there, or operations there. So it seems that there are different levels, each of these three groups, right?
The Houthis are something special. The Houthis are Shiites who oppose the traditional regime, which is Sunni of Yemen, and are in rebellion against it, but haven't managed to conquer the whole country, only about the northern half of it. They feel camaraderie and sympathy for the Palestinians who are fighting the Israelis in the Gaza Strip. And as a result of this, which is, if you like, as a result of common Islamic passions, not necessarily in agreement because one is Sunni and one is Shiite, but they support the Hamas. And as they said, they will continue to shoot at Israel, launch rockets and drones at Israel, so long as Israel is busy fighting the Hamas. But they're not next to Israel. They're 1,500 kilometers away from Israel, and they're not committed in the same way as, of course, Hamas and the Palestinians are to fighting Israel and, if you like, to destroying Israel. I don't think their commitment is as large. I think they have other things to fry in Yemen, which are more important to them. But they decided, for whatever reason, and partly because Iran probably prodded them into it and supplies them, as I say, with their weaponry, to line up with the Hamas and support the Hamas in their battle in the Gaza Strip against Israel. The Hamas is a different ballgame. The Hamas is, if you like, the fighting edge of the Palestinian people. That's how the Palestinians see them. They are the people who are carrying out the resistance against Israel, which the PLO has basically abandoned, in some way are even complicit with Israel in the West Bank. The Hamas is the ones who are busy fighting Israel, which is something which Palestinians, and I can understand them, support because they want, to get out of Israel's clutches, not to be occupied by Israel, by the Israeli military, by the Israeli security system, but also, and this is the part I don't identify with, they also want to destroy Israel. Most Palestinians don't believe Israel should exist. They see Israel as a robber state who stole their land. It belongs to them. Why are the Jews here at all? I don't know, maybe they were here 2,500 years ago. Maybe it's just a legend. That's how many Palestinians see it. In any case, they are European settlers who've come here, taken over our land. We should get it back. It's ours. This is how I think Palestinians in general, at least in their hearts, even so-called moderate Palestinians, see the struggle. Many of them, or some of them, have resigned themselves to the fact that Israel is very powerful. They can't get rid of Israel. At least we should have a state of our own, and the lands they occupy where we live, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, should be abandoned by Israel. And this is what the Hamas is trying to do, or is at least helping to do in fighting Israel. This is how I think most Palestinians see it. The Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip, 2.3 million Palestinians, have been living under Hamas rule for 2 decades, have been educated in Hamas kindergartens and schools, in hatred of Israel, in anti-Semitism, and I think see Israel as a cancer and are unwilling, basically, this population, certainly the fighters of the Hamas, but supporters by their families. I mean, who are the fighters, the Hamas fighters in the Gaza Strip? They're the sons, the children, the brothers and fathers of the rest of the population. It's not as if some of them are civilians who don't care about the battle and just want to have a nice, quiet life, and just their children are busy killing Israelis. It's not that. They're part of the same system. I think they would like to get rid of Israel. This is what their charter says from 1988. Israel must be destroyed, and Islam imposed or organized as the government of and the law of Palestine. That's their end game. And this is what they want. And they will continue the struggle even if Israel manages to suppress the Hamas now, which also looks a long way from being accomplished. They will continue the struggle in the coming decades because the Hamas, the Gaza Strip has no future. This is something which people don't recognize, and Trump does understand. Trump put his finger on it when he said, we would like them to leave. They should leave the Gaza Strip and be transferred somewhere else because there's no future for them. 2.3 million Arabs living in the Gaza Strip in this small territory, 141 square miles or whatever it is, with no industry, no real agriculture, now completely devastated with most of the buildings destroyed, living in cramped, campsites. They can't continue living there. And this is what Trump basically understood. The Gaza Strip, since the 1950s, has been a source of conflict and terrorism against Israel. This is what the Gaza Strip has been doing since the 50s. The refugee population there, filled with hatred for Israel for being uprooted from their homes in 1948. They don't remember and don't mention that they were the ones who began the war against Israel in 1947-48. But the result of that war was most of the population of the Gaza Strip is refugees and their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And they see Israel as an evil presence.
This is where the idea that this is the war against Iran, Operation Rising Lion, is the cutting of the snake's head off, doesn't really add up totally with regard. I mean, in some respect, yes, Hamas will have less material and financial support. But the idea isn't going to be killed with the mullahs in Tehran, that as you've just laid out. But also, if there is regime change or something changes in Iran, they'll be supported by other people. Now, Qatar or other nations, Qatar seems to be the obvious example who have been harboring Hamas leaders and Hamas money. But it's also quite possible that Turkey might fill the vacuum, or another nation. It doesn't seem to me that Operation Rising Lion will have much of an effect on what's going on in Gaza. Do you think I'm wrong?
No, I think you're right. I think that the operation is not going to end the Hamas or its resistance, what it calls its resistance or war against Israel. The Hamas will need new or additional supplies, weaponry, money, at least at first money, from elsewhere. Iran won't be able to provide it, or if there's regime change in Tehran, then it won't provide it possibly. But as you say, Qatar has been financing the Hamas for years. Foreign contributors, Muslims living abroad sympathizing with the Hamas, have given money, and others could do it. Maybe even Turkey will, which Turkey has always supported the Hamas. It's a traditional supporter of the Hamas. Turkey's leader being himself basically Muslim Brotherhood also, a child of Muslim Brotherhood ideology. So it's possible the Turks will take over. But even without the major, doses of money from abroad, the Hamas will continue to exist as an idea, the idea of resistance to Israel and replacing Israel, which is a robber nation, with Islamic rule. This is something which 2 million the 2 million inhabitants of the Gaza Strip have been brought up on, and they will continue to believe this. And what Israel has done over the past 18 months in the Gaza Strip will only increase their vengefulness vis-a-vis Israel.
Right. So so this is interesting, and we were talking about this before we started rolling. I've spoken to friends in Amman and who of Palestinian heritage who will quietly say, we absolutely support Israel getting rid of the Ayatollah. I'm quite pleased about that, but not remotely happy about Gaza. In fact, that for them is just, they're very emotional about it, and one can understand why. Is this an opportunity, given that even in the West, people are now turning and sort of generally support Operation Rising Lion? The polls suggest so anyway, but don't. In the West, the polls suggest that they don't support the operations in Gaza. Is this an opportunity for Israel to change tack in Gaza, to try and, I don't know what, to change their PR, or is their PR sort of irrelevant? Do they care?
Well, PR is less important for Israelis than the actual military threat. And the Hamas proved on the 7th of October, 2023, that they are, as they were then, a military threat to Israel. And if they resurrect themselves as a major military organization, as they were on the 7th of October, they could again represent a threat. So Israelis not that concerned about the PR aspect of it. The problem isn't PR. The problem is politics and international relations. And Israel's position vis-a-vis the Palestinians in terms of international public opinion, which in democracies translates eventually into governmental policy, is that the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories since 1967 has been a military occupation. We presented it as enlightened, but there's no such thing as an enlightened military occupation. Military occupation is always brutal. It's supported by secret services, curfews, mass arrests, the killing of operatives, and so on. All of this is very difficult to live with and to accept, and the Palestinians don't accept it. And the past 50 years of the way this occupation has been projected in the West, in television screens, in the media in general, as brutal, has gradually eroded support for Israel in the West. In other words, the public opinion has been persuaded by the journalists, the media, the television, which shows continuously Israel killing this journal, Israel penetrating this refugee camp, which is actually a slum. People call them refugee camps. They're actually urban slums which are around cities, but they're not camps. But in any case, Israeli devastation of the Palestinians, especially after they rebel, the first intifada, the second intifada, all of this looks terrible on television screens around the West, which is why in American and Western campuses, young people come out into the streets and protest against Israel and want Palestine from the river to the sea and whatever. It's all because of the terrible way that Israel appears in Western media. The second factor in undermining Israel's position vis-a-vis in the conflict in Western public opinion is Netanyahu, the person of Netanyahu. Netanyahu also is depicted rightly as a corrupt politician, as a man without a heart, as a man who doesn't care for peace, and is interested in continually occupying Palestinian lands and oppressing Palestinians. This is also, and he's identified as Israel. Israel is Netanyahu because he's ruled here for the past almost 2 decades. And this too has subverted Israel's image in world public opinion. And the war now between Israel and Iran, as you say, probably has support from the majority of people in the West, certainly the governments of the West, because the Iranian regime has always been seen as evil, and it has declared that it wants to destroy Israel. This is its policy. So people justify what Israel is doing towards the Iranians, and this makes sense. But this will not erase the problem of Israel's image vis-a-vis the Palestinians.
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, I talk about PR, and maybe that was a sort of callous way of posing the question, but more obviously, it's not just Palestinians who are getting killed in large numbers in Gaza, but so too are Israelis operating there. And
in much smaller numbers.
Much smaller numbers.
Yeah, we can't compare.
Sure, but nevertheless, both sides don't want deaths, right? So or you look at me as if maybe...
I don't know.
Okay.
Look, no. There are a lot of Israelis who want deaths of Palestinians, and a lot of Palestinians who want the deaths of Israelis.
Right. Okay. Sorry. Yes. Right. I see what you mean. With regards to Gaza, so there's sort of 2 sides. There's the hostages that still, from the Israeli point of view, the hostages that still remain, and then there's Hamas as existence. Have you sort of explained in quite some detail about how the ideology of Hamas is going to be quite hard to get rid of, but even if they get rid of, even if they rescue the hostages, even if Israel rescue the hostages, and Hamas continues, does that not in some way means that all of the war was kind of for nothing? I mean, apart from taking the hostages back, getting rid of Hamas as an ideology, the inability or the failure to do so means that you're just waiting for this to happen again. With that seems like a failure, and I don't really know what the counter to that would be to someone like Netanyahu.
Well, we have to remember first that the war began with the Hamas attacking Israel. It wasn't Israel launching a war against the Hamas. In fact, Netanyahu was criticized by many Israelis for hesitating for so long and not doing something to suppress the Hamas before October 7th, 2023. The Hamas launched an attack on Israel, killed 1,200 Israelis, almost 1,200 Israelis, took hostage 250 of them. So far in interim exchanges, prisoners for hostages with respites in the fighting for the Hamas, Israel has achieved the return of about 177 of the hostages. Many died, dozens died there, and today remain in Hamas hands something like 20 live Israeli hostages, alongside some 30 bodies of Israelis killed in the process or by the Hamas during their period as hostages. And Israel wants them back. The problem is they can't be rescued by Israeli commando attacks. Commando raids. Israeli commando raids did manage to bring out a handful of hostages, but generally Israeli commandos couldn't do this without the hostages being killed during the raid. And therefore, Israel said, no, we will refrain from raids which will free hostages, because it can't really be done without the hostages and troops raiding being killed in the process. So the alternative for Israel to get back the hostages is a release of Palestinian prisoners and giving the Hamas a respite of, say, 60 or 70 days in order to get back some of the hostages, maybe 10. That was the deal on the table put by Witkoff, Trump's assistant, a few months ago. The Hamas refuses to make this sort of partial deal for 10 hostages, the release of 10 hostages, says we will release all of the hostages if Israel agrees to withdraw completely from the Gaza Strip and end its war against the Hamas. The Hamas demands that this deal be guaranteed so that Israel doesn't break the agreement, be guaranteed by Trump and the world community. So far, Netanyahu has not agreed to do this, to get the release of all the hostages in exchange for ending the war in the Gaza Strip. And that's where we're at the moment. I don't know if this war with Iran is going to affect this situation.
Yeah.
So long as the Hamas sticks to its guns, refuses to release hostages in exchange for a brief period of respite, of ceasefire, there's not going to be a deal, as far as one can see. And I don't know how this war against Iran, even if successful, even if it topples the regime in Iran, which may be one of the aims of the war, or may not even be one of the aims, but may be one of the byproducts of the war, I don't know if that's going to change the Israeli-Hamas equation.
Just on Hezbollah, will there be a change to the equation if Iran is taken out?
Probably. If Iran is taken out, the Hezbollah will not have anybody to supply it with the arms and money it's been getting and we're talking billions of dollars during the past years. It's not going to have a replacement for Tehran. They won't get the money. They won't get the political support. They won't get the arms, the instructors, and whatever. And so far, incidentally, it's interesting to note the Hezbollah, even though we've been striking in Lebanon with our Air Force, with commandos, killing Hezbollah operatives in southern Lebanon, even inside Beirut, the Hezbollah has not reacted over the past months since we signed a sort of ceasefire with the Hamas half a year ago. They haven't responded. So obviously the Hezbollah feels so weak that they won't dare react to what they see as violations of the ceasefire agreement with them. Now that there's this war against Iran, one would have thought maybe the Hezbollah would sort of emerge from the tunnels and start shooting or helping the Iranians in some way with rocketing Israel again, as they used to do in the past. They haven't done that so far. All they've done is threatened Israel to do this, but they haven't done it. And maybe they're so weakened or so afraid of Israeli power that they've decided to lay low for the moment.
So Operation Rising Lion, we're a week in. Nightmare scenario is this continues a long time. Obviously, we've seen reports, dozens of high command of not just the IRGC, but also the Quds have been taken out. Reports also of civilians killed, and they're not just going after the high command. Reports they're going after the police, after the state media. You shake your head. Do you disagree?
No. Israel so far hasn't, as far as I can see, and it's only 7 days. There's more days to come. So far, the Israelis have refrained from hitting civilian targets, installations, people in Iran. It's focused on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the Iranian army, the Iranian nuclear plants, and its scientists.
Right.
They've hit the broadcasting station. This is true, the broadcasting center. I don't think they're yet going after police, which are considered part of the military in some way, maybe the Basij, but they haven't yet gone after the Iranian civil infrastructure, personnel, and plants. The most important of which would be, of course, the Iranian oil production facilities in southeastern Iran. If Israel wanted to really harm the regime there, maybe even lead to its toppling, they would go after this oil or the oil facilities, ending Iranian oil exports, which would impoverish Iran almost completely, almost immediately.
Yeah.
And this may be the next stage if the Iranians do not raise a white flag. This is what Trump would like them to do: raise a white flag. We won't have to bother with bombing you. You will agree to dismantle your nuclear project. How this, incidentally, would be supervised and monitored and guaranteed, even if they said they would do this, even if they sort of raised the white flag, they could still continue doing what they do. And how would America or Israel stop them from continuing the project? I don't know. But, clandestinely. But even if the best of all possible worlds would be that the Iranians surrender, in a sense. This is what Trump would like.
I'm sure he would like that, but it seems very hard to imagine that, and I don't really see what the golden bridge is for the Ayatollah Khomeini out of this, because he's an Islamist. He has said his whole life, death to America, death to Israel. It would be utter humiliation for him to say, okay, sorry.
So far, what we've done is an utter humiliation.
It is an utter humiliation.
Even without that.
So it seems to me that more likely is that if he's in that situation, he throws everything at the wall and goes out on a sort of Islamist suicide run. Just knowing the ideology, it's very hard to imagine how he can save face in any possible way and remain.
It's not even only a matter of ideology; it's a matter of patriotism. In other words, the Iranians also, in addition to these ayatollahs, don't like seeing what Israel is doing to Iran. It's a national humiliation, not just a religious humiliation.
Yes.
Why Allah isn't coming to support them in terms of the ayatollahs? Probably the ayatollahs are all wondering, why is this happening to us?
Yeah.
Why is God allowing this? But certainly it's a humiliation, and you're right. Their pride may prevent them from raising a white flag, even if they realize that they're going to be utterly destroyed. At least the regime and the Ayatollah himself, the supreme leader, whom has been in Israel's crosshairs now. For a few days now, Israel has been saying, essentially, we're going to kill you. So it's quite possible that they will want to go out in a blaze of glory, Islam fighting the Jews, even if they're losing this war. It could be that's the way we're heading.
It could be. Now, we've had many readers and followers on the show's Substack writing in questions, and the vast majority, 90%, are about regime change. So what I want to ask you is about that, but I'm going to invite the audience at this point to come over to winstonmarshall.co.uk to hear that conversation about regime change, which I hope to ask lots of American viewers, particularly concerned following Afghanistan, Libya, and Iraq, about what it might be, what it might look like. So I want to explore that with you there. I also will hopefully get to touch on the Abraham Accords and the sort of alliance of peace, let's call it that. But as I said earlier, what I see is what I'm hopeful about as a future for relations between the West and the Islamic world. Well, on that note, Dr. Morris, an absolute privilege speaking with you. Thank you so much. I know you've got a new book that you're sitting on, which I will look out for, the war crimes committed by both sides in the 1947-1948 war here in Israel. Is there any I's that need dotting or T's that need crossing or anything you'd like to bring?
I think we've crossed them all.
Okay. Dr. Morris, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching The Winston Marshall Show with Dr. Benny Morris. Remember, head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk now to hear the rest of that conversation where Dr. Morris takes your questions about regime change in Iran. If you want to support the show, remember all you have to do is press subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from, and here on YouTube or on Rumble. And until next time, be well.